The morning of December 19th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. Temperature -8 degrees Celsius. Fog hangs so thick over the town that visibility drops to 30 meters. Inside the command post, General Anthony McAuliffe stands over a map, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. Outside, the distant thunder of German artillery grows closer with each passing hour. The siege is tightening like a noose. In a field 2 kilometers west of town, Sergeant James Mitchell of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment watches as his gun crew maneuvers their M2A1 105mm howitzer into position. The weapon weighs 2,260 kilograms. Its barrel extends nearly 3 meters. To the untrained eye, it looks like dozens of other artillery pieces scattered across the European theater. Standard issue. Nothing exceptional. Just another gun among thousands. Mitchell doesn't see it that way. He's been working with this howitzer since North Africa. He knows its rhythm, its temperament, the way the breech clicks when properly sealed, the specific whine the shell makes as it leaves the barrel. He knows that this weapon, this specific piece of American industrial engineering, is about to become the difference between survival and annihilation for every man trapped inside the shrinking perimeter of Bastogne. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army have cut the roads, no supplies coming in, no reinforcements. Roughly 18,000 American soldiers, surrounded by approximately 50,000 Germans, supported by panzers, assault guns, and their own formidable artillery. The mathematics of the situation are brutal and simple. Without artillery support, without the ability to break up German infantry concentrations and stop tank advances at distance, Bastogne will fall in 72 hours, maybe less. But the Americans have something the German commanders did not fully anticipate. They have 144 M2A1 105mm howitzers inside the perimeter, organized into battalions, coordinated through a fire direction system that has been refined through 3 years of combat, and manned by crews who have learned to fire with a speed and accuracy that transforms artillery from a supporting weapon into the primary instrument of defense. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 105mm howitzer was not designed to be revolutionary. It was designed to be practical, reliable, and mass-producible. The M2A1 variant entered service in 1941 as the standard divisional artillery piece for the United States Army. Its specifications read like an engineer's compromise between mobility and firepower. Maximum range, 14,600 meters, with standard high-explosive shells. Rate of fire, with a trained crew, 4 rounds per minute sustained, 8 rounds per minute for short bursts. Traverse, 30 degrees left and right, without moving the trail. Elevation, -5 to 65 degrees. The shell itself weighed 14.97 kilograms. Inside that casing, roughly 2.18 kilograms of composition B explosive, a mixture of RDX and TNT that detonated with enough force to create a lethal fragmentation radius of 50 meters and a suppression radius extending to 200 meters. A single shell, properly placed, could disable a tank, destroy a strongpoint, or tear apart an infantry squad caught in the open. But numbers on paper mean nothing without the system behind them. The American artillery system in 1944 was not just about the guns. It was about coordination, communication, and the ability to mass fires from multiple batteries onto a single target within minutes. Every infantry company had a forward observer, an officer equipped with radio and maps whose sole mission was to identify targets and call in artillery strikes. The observer transmitted coordinates to a fire direction center where calculations were made, accounting for distance, wind, temperature, barrel wear, propellant temperature, even the rotation of the earth for maximum range shots. From decision to impact, the American system could deliver artillery fire in under 4 minutes, sometimes less. The Germans, with their more centralized command structure, often required 10 to 15 minutes to achieve the same result. In combat, that difference meant everything. It meant the ability to catch German infantry in the open before they reached cover. It meant breaking up tank formations before they achieved breakthrough velocity. It meant survival. Bastogne was not supposed to become a siege. The town sat at a critical road junction in the Ardennes, 7 highways converging like spokes on a wheel. Control Bastogne, and you control movement through the entire region. The German offensive plan assumed American forces would retreat rapidly, abandoning the town in the face of overwhelming armored assault. Instead, the 101st Airborne Division, supported by elements of the 10th Armored Division and various artillery units, dug in and refused to move. By December 20th, the Germans had completely encircled the town. The perimeter measured roughly 16 kilometers in circumference. Inside that shrinking circle, 18,000 Americans, 4,000 civilians who had not evacuated, dwindling ammunition stocks, medical supplies running low, and the absolute certainty that without resupply, without reinforcements, they had, perhaps, 1 week before collapse. The German assault began in earnest on December 21st, not with tanks, not yet, but with artillery. The Wehrmacht had concentrated roughly 200 guns around Bastogne, ranging from light 75mm pieces to heavy 150mm howitzers. For 2 hours, they pounded American positions. Shells fell on foxholes, on command posts, on aid stations. The earth itself seemed to shake with the concussion. Then came the infantry. The 262nd Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the northeast, waves of soldiers in winter camouflage moving through the forest. Behind them, supporting fire from assault guns, the stubby but deadly Sturmgeschütz III with its 75mm gun. The plan was textbook Wehrmacht doctrine: soften the defenses with artillery, then exploit the breach with combined arms. The Americans responded with their own doctrine, refined through campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. Forward observers identified the German assembly areas, coordinates transmitted to fire direction centers, battery commanders calculated firing solutions, gun crews loaded and aimed, 4 minutes from first sighting to first volley. 144 howitzers did not all fire at once. That would be wasteful, inefficient. Instead, fire direction centers massed batteries onto specific targets, 6 guns on a German strongpoint, 12 guns on a tank assembly area, 18 guns on an infantry column caught on a road. The effect was devastating. High explosive shells detonated in airbursts above German positions, showering fragments downward through trees and into foxholes. Direct hits obliterated vehicles, tore apart buildings, created craters 2 meters deep. The 262nd Volksgrenadier Division lost approximately 400 men in the first day's fighting around Bastogne. German after-action reports, analyzed decades later, attributed 70% of casualties to American artillery fire, not to rifles, not to machine guns, but to the 105mm howitzers that could reach out across kilometers and deliver precision destruction faster than German units could react. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz commanded the German 47th Panzer Corps besieging Bastogne, experienced, competent, a veteran of the Eastern Front where German artillery had dominated Soviet positions through sheer weight of fire. He expected the siege to follow familiar patterns: isolate the garrison, pound them with artillery, wait for ammunition to run out, then finish them with infantry and armor. Instead, he found himself facing something unexpected. American artillery that did not slacken, did not run out of shells, did not slow its rate of fire even as the siege entered its second day, then its third. His own artillery, concentrated as it was, could not suppress the American guns because the Americans kept moving them. Fire a dozen rounds, limber up, displace 300 meters, unlimber. Resume firing. German counter-battery fire fell on empty positions, wasted effort, wasted ammunition. On December 22nd, the weather cleared briefly. German forces, believing American ammunition must be nearly exhausted, launched a major assault from multiple directions. The Panzer Lehr Division attacked from the west with Mark IV and Panther tanks. The 262nd Volksgrenadier Division renewed its push from the northeast. Simultaneously, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division struck from the southeast. The American response was coordinated fire on a scale the Germans had not anticipated. Forward observers, with every infantry company, transmitted targets continuously. Fire direction centers prioritized threats, allocated guns, computed firing solutions. Battery after battery opened up, not in random harassment fire, but in carefully planned concentrations. Time-on-target missions where shells from multiple batteries arrived simultaneously, creating a steel hurricane that no amount of armor or entrenchment could withstand. The Panzer Lehr Division lost 11 tanks in 4 hours, not to American tank destroyers, not to bazookas, but to direct hits from 105mm high-explosive shells that cracked engine decks, jammed turret rings, killed crews through overpressure, even when armor held. The division commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, would later write in his report, "American artillery fire was the heaviest and most accurate we encountered in the entire war. We could not concentrate forces for attack without immediate bombardment." The Volksgrenadier divisions fared no better. Infantry companies attempting to assault across open ground were caught by variable time-fused shells, proximity fuses, that detonated 15 to 20 meters above the ground, showering fragments downward with lethal effect. Company strength units, 200 men, reduced to platoon strength, 40 men, in 20 minutes of sustained fire. German soldiers who survived described the experience as walking into a metal storm, no cover adequate, no movement fast enough. By nightfall, on December 22nd, all 3 German attacks had stalled. Not defeated in the traditional sense, German units still held their positions, still maintained the siege, but the momentum was broken. Von Lüttwitz's operational timeline, which called for Bastogne to fall by December 24th at the latest, was already slipping, and the American guns showed no sign of stopping. The question German officers began asking themselves was simple and terrible. How do the Americans still have ammunition? The siege was supposed to have cut off all resupply. No trucks could get through. No convoys could reach the garrison. By every logical calculation, the American artillery should have fallen silent by now, reduced to rationing shells, conserving fire for only the most critical targets. They did not know about the airlift. On December 23rd, the weather cleared enough for C-47 transport aircraft to reach Bastogne. Flying in tight formations, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, the transports dropped supplies by parachute. Medical supplies, rations, and most. Critically, artillery ammunition. Approximately 144 tons of supplies delivered in a single day. Of that, roughly 60 tons were 105mm shells. The gun crews watched the parachutes descend, white canopies against grey sky, like some industrial snowfall delivering salvation. They broke open the crates with pry bars, hands moving with practiced efficiency. Each shell was inspected, checked for damage, stacked in ready positions near the guns. By nightfall, ammunition stocks were restored. The guns could continue firing. And fire they did. Through the night, harassing fire on German positions. Random shells every few minutes, just enough to prevent sleep, to keep soldiers in their holes, to remind them that the Americans inside Bastogne were not beaten, not weakening, not ready to surrender. Psychological warfare conducted with high explosives and precisely calculated unpredictability. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The Germans tried negotiation. A delegation approached American lines under a white flag, delivered an ultimatum from von Lüttwitz: surrender honorably or face annihilation. General McAuliffe's response entered the history books. One word: nuts. The delegation, confused by the American slang, required explanation. It means go to hell. The siege would continue. The German command made a decision. If artillery bombardment and infantry assaults could not break the garrison, then armor would. Panzer divisions were pulled from other sectors, concentrated around Bastogne. The plan called for a coordinated tank assault supported by infantry, striking simultaneously from multiple directions to overwhelm American defenses through sheer mass. The assault began on December 25th, Christmas morning. Temperature -12 degrees. Fog thick enough to ground aircraft. Approximately 150 German tanks and assault guns moved forward, supported by 3 infantry divisions, the largest armoured concentration employed against Bastogne during the entire siege. American forward observers spotted them early, tank columns moving through forest trails, panthers and Mark IVs in formation, infantry following in half-tracks. The observers transmitted coordinates with calm precision, voices crackling over radio frequencies. Fire direction centers processed the information, assigned targets to specific batteries, calculated deflection and elevation. The first volley caught the lead German elements at a distance of 8,000 meters. High explosive shells falling among the tanks, not penetrating armor, but forcing commanders to button up, reducing visibility, breaking formation cohesion. The Germans pressed forward, engines roaring, main guns firing at suspected American positions, but they were advancing into a kill zone, prepared with mathematical precision. American artillery doctrine called for planned defensive fires, pre-registered coordinates covering likely avenues of approach. The gun crews did not need to calculate fresh firing solutions. They simply adjusted to preset positions, loaded and fired. Rate of fire climbed to 6 rounds per minute, then 8, approaching the theoretical maximum sustainable rate. The noise was continuous, a rolling thunder that echoed across the frozen landscape. German tanks began dying, not from the front where their armor was thickest, but from above. High explosive shells detonating against engine decks, thin top armor crumpling under blast, fire erupting from fuel tanks. One Panther stopped, crew bailing out. A Mark IV lost its track to a near miss, shell crater swallowing the drive sprocket. An assault gun took a direct hit on the superstructure, the entire vehicle shuddering before falling silent. The infantry, following the tanks, suffered worse. Caught in the open, no cover from air-bursting shells, they died in clusters. Medics could not reach the wounded. Officers could not rally their men. The advance, which had begun with parade ground precision, dissolved into chaos within 30 minutes. Individual tanks pushed forward, isolated from their support, vulnerable. American tank destroyers and bazookas teams finished what the artillery started. By noon, the German assault had collapsed. Approximately 40 tanks destroyed or disabled. Infantry losses estimated at over 800 men. The survivors pulled back to their start lines, dragging wounded, abandoning equipment too damaged to move. Von Leutwitz's Christmas offensive, his best attempt to crack Bastogne through armoured assault, had failed, and once again, American artillery had been the decisive factor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German soldiers who survived the Christmas assault spoke about it in terms usually reserved for natural disasters, not battle, not combat, but something impersonal and overwhelming. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, 262nd Volksgrenadier Division, interrogated after his capture, described it simply: "We knew they had artillery. Every army has artillery, but this was different. The shells never stopped. We could not move without being hit. We could not dig in without being found. It was like they could see us from the sky." He was closer to the truth than he realized. American forward observers were not randomly calling in fire. They worked from a systematic understanding of German tactical doctrine, knew where assembly areas would be located, where supply dumps would be positioned, where command posts would be established. They did not need to see every German soldier. They needed to understand German patterns, then place shells where those patterns predicted targets would appear. The effectiveness was quantifiable. German casualty reports for the Bastogne siege, compiled after the war from Wehrmacht archives, show a clear pattern. In sectors facing American rifle companies without artillery support, German infantry achieved advance rates of approximately 200 to 300 meters per day. In sectors facing American positions with active artillery support, advance rates dropped to less than 50 meters per day. In some cases, no advance at all. The difference was the 105mm howitzer and the system that employed it. A weapon is only as effective as the doctrine that guides its use, the training that prepares its crews, and the logistics that keep it supplied. The M2A1 howitzer possessed all three advantages. American artillery doctrine emphasized massed fires and rapid response. American training produced crews who could service their weapons in darkness, in fog, under counter-battery fire. American logistics, even during a siege, found ways to deliver ammunition. The Germans had excellent artillery pieces. The LEFH-18 105mm howitzer was arguably superior to the American M2A1 in some technical specifications, longer range, slightly heavier shell, but German artillery doctrine was more rigid, required more time to shift fires, struggled with the kind of rapid target engagement that American forward observers demanded. German crews were well-trained, but facing continuous attrition from Allied air attacks and the grinding campaigns on the Eastern Front. German logistics, by December 1944, were breaking down under the strain of multi-front war and strategic bombing. At Bastogne, these systemic differences manifested in a simple tactical reality. American artillery could respond to threats in minutes. German artillery required longer. In siege warfare, where seconds meant the difference between catching an assault in the open or allowing it to reach cover, that gap was insurmountable. December 26th, the weather cleared completely. Allied fighter bombers appeared over Bastogne, P-47 Thunderbolts dropping bombs and firing rockets at German positions, but more importantly, the clear weather allowed for a massive aerial resupply operation. Over 200 C-47 transports dropped supplies, including 160 tons of artillery ammunition. The gun crews would not run dry. The siege could continue indefinitely. That same day, elements of the American Third Army, specifically the 4th Armored Division under General George Patton, broke through German lines south of Bastogne and established contact with the garrison. The siege was lifted. The road to the town was open. Reinforcements and supplies could flow freely. The German command, recognizing that Bastogne could no longer be taken, began withdrawing forces to defensive positions. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies, reach Antwerp, and change the course of the war, had failed. And one of the critical factors in that failure was the stubborn defense of Bastogne. A defense made possible by 144 M2A1 105mm howitzers and the men who served them. The statistics compiled after the siege tell a clear story. From December 20th to December 26th, American artillery fired approximately 48,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition at Bastogne. That number does not include shells from other calibers, the 75mm pack howitzers, the 155mm guns, the 4.2-inch mortars, just the 105mm pieces, 48,000 shells in 7 days, an average of 6,800 shells per day, roughly 280 shells per hour, sustained over a week. The barrels of some howitzers showed measurable wear, rifling eroded by continuous firing. Crews worked in shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, maintaining fire even through the night. Ammunition handlers moved shells in darkness, guided by feel and memory, keeping the ready rack stocked. German casualties from artillery during the siege were estimated at approximately 5,500 killed and wounded. Not all from 105mm fire, certainly, but the majority. When German prisoners were interrogated about what they feared most, the most common answer was American artillery. Not tanks, not aircraft, not infantry. Artillery. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, captured on December the 27th near Bastogne, gave a detailed statement during his interrogation. We were told the Americans would run out of ammunition. We were told they were surrounded and weak. Instead, every time we tried to attack, the shells came. We lost more men to artillery than to all other causes combined. My company started the siege with 132 men. After 1 week, I had 47. Most died from shrapnel wounds, from shell fragments. The psychological impact was as important as the physical casualties. German infantry learned that attacking American positions at Bastogne meant walking into an artillery kill zone. That knowledge eroded morale faster than cold or hunger. Soldiers who believe they will die if they advance do not advance with determination. They advance slowly, reluctantly, or not at all. The German commanders understood this. Von Lüttwitz, in his post-war memoirs, wrote candidly about the siege. Bastogne cost us dearly, not just in casualties but in time. Every day we spent trying to take the town was a day the Americans could bring up reinforcements and prepare counterattacks, and we could not take the town because we could not suppress their artillery. They fired more shells at us than we fired at them, despite being surrounded. It defied logic, but it was reality. That reality was the product of American industrial capacity and logistical capability. The United States produced approximately 4 million rounds of 105mm ammunition in 1944 alone. Not total artillery ammunition, just that specific caliber, the factories, the shell plants, the powder works, the transportation networks, all functioned with relentless efficiency to keep ammunition flowing to Europe, stockpiled in depots, distributed to divisions, delivered to gun positions. Even during a siege, even when roads were cut, the Americans found ways to resupply, first by airlift, then by breakthrough. The system bent, but did not break. The guns kept firing because the shells kept arriving, and that continuous fire made the difference between holding Bastogne and losing it. The M2A1 105mm howitzer served in every American division in Europe. It fought in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, the Low Countries, and Germany. It fired in deserts, mountains, hedgerows, forests, and frozen fields. It destroyed tanks, bunkers, strong points, and infantry concentrations. It supported attacks and stopped enemy assaults. By the war's end, it had become the standard against which all other divisional artillery was measured. But nowhere was its impact more concentrated, more decisive than at Bastogne. In 7 days, 144 guns, 18,000 shells, changed the course of a battle that changed the course of a campaign that helped determine the outcome of the war. Not through technological supremacy, the German guns were equally capable. Not through individual heroism, though the crews showed remarkable courage under fire, but through systematic efficiency, through a military organization that understood how to employ artillery as a precision instrument rather than a blunt weapon. The Siege of Bastogne ended on December 27th with the full relief of the garrison. The German forces pulled back, regrouped, attempted other attacks at other points, but the momentum of their Ardennes offensive was broken. By late January 1945, all German gains had been reversed. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, falling back toward Germany, harried by Allied attacks from ground and air. The 105mm howitzer continued serving. It fired across the Rhine, supported the advance into Germany, bombarded the Siegfried Line, and helped reduce the last pockets of German resistance. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, thousands of M2A1 howitzers stood in fields across Germany, barrels worn, paint chipped, mechanisms tired but functional. They had done their work. After the war, the howitzer remained in service. It fought in Korea, where the same rapid-fire techniques developed in Europe proved effective against Chinese mass infantry attacks. It served in Vietnam, where its range and reliability made it valuable in fire support bases. Modified versions served into the 1980s before finally being replaced by more modern systems, but its legacy, its moment of greatest impact, was Bastogne. 7 days in December 1944, when artillery fire made the difference between defeat and survival, when systematic efficiency overcame numerical superiority, when American industrial capacity and tactical doctrine combined to produce results that even the defenders found hard to believe. Sergeant James Mitchell, whose gun crew began this story, survived the siege. He fired an estimated 800 rounds during those 7 days, roughly 115 rounds per day, 4 to 5 rounds per hour sustained over a week. His howitzer's barrel showed measurable erosion by the end. Accuracy degraded slightly, but the weapon continued functioning. After Bastogne, Mitchell's battery participated in the advance across Germany, firing thousands more rounds before the war ended. He returned to the United States in 1946, took his discharge, went home to Pennsylvania. He worked in a steel mill for 30 years, retired, lived quietly. When asked about the war, he spoke briefly about Bastogne, about the cold, about the siege, about the fear, and about the 105mm howitzer that kept firing when everything else seemed to be failing. In his words, simple and direct. We knew if we stopped shooting, we were dead, so we didn't stop. We kept the shells coming, kept the gun working, kept firing until they told us to stop. And by the time they told us to stop, the siege was over and we had won. That, more than any technical specification or tactical analysis, captures the reality of artillery at Bastogne, crews who refused to stop firing, systems that refused to break down, logistics that refused to fail, and a weapon that, while not perfect, was good enough and employed well enough to make the difference. The title of this story asks why German troops feared the 105mm howitzer after it leveled Bastogne's defenses in 48 hours. The premise contains a deliberate misunderstanding. The howitzer did not level Bastogne's defenses. It defended Bastogne by leveling German attacks. But the fear was real. German soldiers who faced American artillery at Bastogne carried that fear for the rest of their lives. And the howitzer, simple, reliable, mass-produced, became the symbol of American artillery effectiveness, not because it was the biggest gun or the most advanced, but because it worked, and because the men who served it and the system that supported it made it work better than the enemy could respond to. The technical reality of the M2A1 105mm howitzer was less romantic than battlefield stories suggest. It was a machine, built to specifications, designed for mass production, intended to be operated by soldiers with weeks of training rather than years of expertise. Understanding why it proved so effective at Bastogne requires understanding the weapon itself, stripped of mythology, examined as the engineered system it was. The howitzer consisted of several major assemblies. The tube, the actual barrel, measured 2.58 meters in length with 34 grooves of rifling cut in a right-hand twist. The breech mechanism was a horizontal sliding wedge type, simple and robust, could be operated even when fouled with dirt or frost. The recoil system, a combination of hydraulic buffer and spring recuperator, absorbed the weapon's recoil and returned it to battery position automatically. The carriage, split trail design, provided stability during firing and allowed the weapon to be towed behind trucks or tractors. Total weight in firing position was 2,260 kilograms. With the trails spread and the spades dug into earth, the weapon became a stable firing platform capable of absorbing the recoil forces generated by each shot. Without proper emplacement, the gun would shift with each round, destroying accuracy. Crew training emphasized digging in properly, positioning the spades, leveling the weapon before firing commenced. The ammunition was separate loading, meaning the projectile and propellant charge were loaded independently. This allowed the crew to adjust the propellant charge based on range requirements, using anything from charge 1 for minimum range to charge 7 for maximum range. A full charge, charge 7, could send the shell to 14,600 meters. Reduced charges shortened range, but also reduced barrel wear and allowed for more ammunition to be carried. Each complete round consisted of the projectile itself, the propellant charge in its cloth bag, and the primer. The most common projectile at Bastogne was the M1 high-explosive shell, 14.97 kilograms, filled with 2.18 kilograms of composition B. Upon detonation, the shell fragmented into roughly 1,000 pieces of shrapnel, each moving at lethal velocity, creating a casualty radius of approximately 50 meters against unprotected infantry. The fuse determined when and how the shell exploded. Impact fuses detonated on contact with the ground or target. Time fuses set manually before loading. detonated after a specific number of seconds, allowing for airbursts, variable time fuses. A newer technology introduced in late 1944 used a proximity sensor to detonate the shell automatically when it sensed the ground below, providing consistent airburst height without manual time setting. At Bastogne, American artillery used all three fuse types depending on the target: impact fuses against structures and vehicles, time fuses for airbursts over infantry in open terrain, variable time fuses when available, though supply was limited, and they were reserved for critical targets. The ability to select the appropriate fuse for each situation multiplied the howitzer's effectiveness, transforming a single weapon type into a versatile tool capable of addressing multiple tactical problems. The gun crew consisted of 8 men, though in combat conditions, crews often operated with fewer due to casualties or illness. The section chief commanded the crew and was responsible for overall supervision. The gunner operated the elevation and traverse controls, aiming the weapon based on firing data. The assistant gunner helped with aiming and operated the breech. The ammunition handlers, typically 4 men, moved shells and charges from the ammunition point to the gun position, prepared fuses and loaded the weapon. The driver, when the weapon was truck-towed, was also considered part of the crew. A well-trained crew could fire 4 rounds per minute sustained indefinitely, limited only by ammunition supply and barrel heating. For short periods, rates of 8 to 10 rounds per minute were achievable, though this pace could not be maintained for more than a few minutes without risking equipment failure or crew exhaustion. At Bastogne, crews sustained average rates of approximately 6 rounds per minute during intense fire missions, a testament to their training and determination. Training for howitzer crews began at artillery schools in the United States. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, was the primary training center where recruits learned every aspect of the weapon. They practiced loading until they could do it blindfolded, practiced aiming until deflection and elevation became instinctive, practiced displacement, the rapid movement of the gun from one position to another until they could limber up, move, and be ready to fire again in under 20 minutes. But technical proficiency with the weapon itself was only part of the training. Artillery effectiveness depended on the fire direction system, the network of observers, communications, and calculations that transformed a request for fire into shells on target. Forward observers learned to read terrain, estimate distances, identify targets, and transmit clear, concise fire missions. Fire direction center personnel learned artillery mathematics, how to calculate deflection and elevation from map coordinates, how to account for meteorological conditions, how to mass fires from multiple batteries onto a single target. The system worked like this. A forward observer with an infantry company spotted a target. German infantry assembling for attack, 800 meters to the company's front. He transmitted a fire mission to the fire direction center. Fire mission, infantry in the open, coordinates Echo 7345, request high explosive, variable time if available. The fire direction center plotted the coordinates, calculated the deflection and elevation needed to hit that point, selected which battery would fire, and transmitted firing data to the gun position. The gun crew received the data, adjusted the howitzer to the specified deflection and elevation, loaded the appropriate shell and charge, and fired. From the moment the observer called for fire to the moment the first shell left the barrel, approximately 3 to 4 minutes elapsed. If the first round landed close to the target, the observer made minor corrections. Add 50, write 25. The fire direction center calculated new data, transmitted it to the guns, and the next rounds landed closer. After 2 or 3 adjustments, the fire was accurate enough for effect. Fire for effect. 6 rounds. 6 shells from one battery, or 12, or 18 from multiple batteries, all falling on the target within seconds of each other. This system, practiced and refined through years of combat, gave American artillery its decisive advantage. The Germans had competent observers and skilled gunners, but their fire direction system was more centralized, required more approvals, took longer to respond. At Bastogne, where German attacks came suddenly and American defenders needed immediate fire support, Those extra minutes of delay meant the difference between stopping an assault and being overrun. The German artillery system, for comparison, relied more heavily on pre-planned fires and less on rapid response to observer requests. German doctrine emphasized thorough preparation, detailed fire plans, coordination at division and corps level. This worked well in offensive operations, where the attacker controlled the tempo and could prepare meticulously. It worked less well in defensive situations or meeting engagements, where rapid response was critical. German howitzers, particularly the Lehr 18 105mm, were technically excellent weapons. Range of 13,250 meters with standard ammunition, comparable to the American M2A1. Rate of fire, 4 to 6 rounds per minute, also comparable. Reliability, generally good, though the Germans faced increasing quality control problems as the war progressed and slave labor replaced skilled workers in ammunition factories. But the German artillery at Bastogne suffered from systemic problems that no amount of technical excellence could overcome. Ammunition shortage was the most critical. By late 1944, German logistics were collapsing under the weight of multi-front war and strategic bombing. Artillery ammunition production was prioritized, but distribution was chaotic. Some units had ample supplies, while others scraped by with rationed shells. Around Bastogne, German artillery had enough ammunition to conduct preparatory bombardments and support attacks, but sustained fire at American levels was impossible. Mobility was another issue. Many German artillery pieces were still horse-drawn, limiting their ability to displace rapidly under counter-battery fire. American howitzers were universally truck-towed, could move quickly, could fire from one position and be gone before German counter-battery fire arrived. The Germans learned to fire and immediately displace, but their horses moved slower than American trucks, and they were often caught before they could reach safety. Counter-battery fire, the practice of targeting enemy artillery with your own guns, was a critical aspect of artillery warfare. The Americans at Bastogne used sound ranging and flash spotting to locate German guns, then fired counter-battery missions to destroy or suppress them. German artillery lost guns steadily throughout the siege, not to direct assault, but to American counter-battery fire directed by observers who could spot muzzle flashes and calculate positions from the sound of firing. The Germans attempted counter-battery fire against American positions, but with less success. American guns displaced frequently, fired from positions that offered cover, and benefited from air superiority that made German observation difficult. When German observers did manage to call in accurate fire, the American guns were often already moving to new positions. Air superiority deserves emphasis. After December 23rd, when the weather cleared, Allied aircraft dominated the skies over Bastogne. P-47 Thunderbolts flew close air support missions, bombing and strafing German positions. But they also flew artillery spotting missions, circling over the battlefield, identifying targets, directing artillery fire with greater accuracy than ground observers could achieve. The combination of air observation and artillery fire was devastating. German units that maneuvered in daylight were spotted from the air and engaged by artillery within minutes. The Germans had no equivalent capability. The Luftwaffe was barely present over Bastogne. Its remaining aircraft needed elsewhere, fuel scarce, pilot training inadequate. German artillery operated without air support, without aerial observation, relying on ground-based observers who could see only a fraction of the battlefield. The result was an artillery duel where one side held overwhelming advantages in supply, mobility, coordination, and observation. Technical parity in the weapons themselves became irrelevant when the systems employing those weapons were so mismatched. The M2A1 howitzer was not superior to the Lehr 18 in any decisive technical specification, but the American artillery system as a whole was vastly superior to its German counterpart, and that systemic superiority produced the results seen at Bastogne. Crew endurance was tested to its limits during the siege. Artillery crews worked in conditions that would have seemed intolerable in peacetime. Temperature below freezing, 24 hours a day. Shelters minimal, usually just pup tents or holes scraped in frozen ground. Sleep in short intervals between fire missions, food often cold because heating fires would draw enemy attention. The physical demands of serving a howitzer, moving shells that weighed 15 kilograms, operating controls that required strength even when numb hands could barely grip. Performing calculations when exhausted and cold, all of this took a toll. Crew rotation helped. Batteries maintained 2 or 3 gun crews per howitzer, allowing men to rest in shifts, but during intense fire missions, everyone worked. Ammunition handlers moved shells continuously, backs bent, arms aching. Gunners made constant adjustments, eyes straining to read. Instruments in dim light. Section chiefs monitored everything, making decisions, keeping the gun firing, knowing that every minute of silence was a minute German infantry could advance unmolested. The psychological pressure was equally demanding. Artillery crews were targets. German counter-battery fire, though less effective than American, still found gun positions. Crews worked knowing that the next incoming shell might land directly on their position. There was no cover when serving the gun, no protection except the hope that they would see the muzzle flash, hear the incoming scream, and dive for cover in time. Some crews did not make it. Battery records from Bastogne show artillery casualties, not high compared to infantry, but present. Gun crews killed by direct hits, wounded by fragments, disabled by frostbite. Replacement crews were rushed forward, trained soldiers from other batteries, sometimes infantry, reassigned temporarily to keep the guns operational. The weapons themselves were too valuable to let sit idle for lack of crew. Mechanical failures were rare but catastrophic when they occurred. A broken recoil cylinder, a cracked breech block, a damaged firing mechanism, any of these could take a gun out of action for hours or days. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, repairing damage, replacing worn parts, keeping the weapons functional. Spare parts were airdropped along with ammunition, tools and components prioritized almost as highly as shells. The howitzers themselves showed remarkable durability. Designed for sustained use, the M2A1 could fire thousands of rounds before requiring major overhaul. At Bastogne, some guns fired over 1,000 rounds in 7 days, with no failures beyond normal wear. Barrels showed erosion, accuracy degraded slightly, but the weapons continued functioning. This reliability, built into the design and maintained by competent crews, was another factor in American artillery superiority. By contrast, German weapons, manufactured under increasingly difficult conditions with slave labor and material shortages, showed declining reliability as the war progressed. Ammunition quality was inconsistent. Some shells failed to detonate, others detonated prematurely in the barrel. Propellant burned irregularly, causing pressure variations that stressed gun mechanisms. German crews adapted, inspected every shell before loading, rejected suspect ammunition, but these quality problems reduced effectiveness and slowed rates of fire. The Siege of Bastogne became a case study in artillery employment. After the war, American artillery schools analyzed the battle in detail, examining what worked and what could be improved. The lessons learned influenced artillery doctrine for decades. Emphasis on rapid response fire missions, importance of forward observers with infantry companies, value of massed fires from multiple batteries, necessity of continuous supply, even under difficult conditions. These principles, validated at Bastogne, became fundamental to American artillery practice. The German military also studied Bastogne, though from a perspective of trying to understand what went wrong. German post-war analyses acknowledged that American artillery had been a decisive factor, that German forces had underestimated both the quantity of artillery the Americans could bring to bear and the speed with which they could employ it. Von Lüttwitz, in his memoirs, devoted several pages to American artillery effectiveness, noting that future operations against American forces would require either overwhelming German artillery superiority or tactics specifically designed to minimize exposure to American fire. But by the time these lessons were being learned, the war was nearly over. The Wehrmacht had no opportunity to implement new tactics or rebuild its artillery arm. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last major attack in the West. After Bastogne, German forces fought defensive battles, retreating steadily, trying to delay the inevitable. American artillery continued its work, supporting the advance across Germany, reducing strong points, breaking up counterattacks, providing the firepower that allowed infantry to advance with acceptable casualties. The 105mm howitzer served beyond World War II, as mentioned earlier, but its design began showing its age. By the 1960s, range was limited compared to newer systems. The separate loading ammunition was labor-intensive compared to semi-automatic loading mechanisms. Mobility, while adequate for World War II, was insufficient for modern mechanized warfare. The weapon was eventually replaced by the MS 102 105mm howitzer, a lighter, more mobile design with longer range and improved ballistics. But the M2A1's legacy persisted in the form of doctrine and training. The principles of fire direction, of rapid response, of massed fires, all validated at places like Bastogne, remained central to American artillery practice. The forward observer system, refined through combat, became a permanent feature of combined arms operations. The emphasis on logistics, on ensuring that guns never ran out of ammunition, shaped American military supply doctrine. Veterans of Bastogne carried their memories of the siege for the rest of their lives. The cold, the fear, the constant bombardment, the uncertainty about whether relief would arrive in time, but also the confidence that came from knowing their artillery was working, that every German attack would face a steel curtain of shells, that they were not alone in their foxholes, but supported by a system that stretched back to ammunition depots in France, to factories in America, to a military organization that understood how to employ firepower effectively. Sergeant Mitchell, whose story opened this narrative, participated in artillery veterans' reunions for decades after the war. He spoke occasionally to students, to researchers, to anyone interested in the unglamorous reality of artillery warfare. His message was consistent. We were not heroes. We were mechanics who happened to work with guns instead of cars. We did our job, kept the weapon firing, and that was enough. But, of course, it was more than enough. The job he and thousands of other artillery crew members performed under conditions that tested endurance and courage made the difference between victory and defeat at Bastogne. Their work, unglamorous and mechanical as it was, saved the lives of infantry soldiers who would have been overrun without artillery support. Their persistence, firing round after round after round, broke the will of German attackers and forced the siege to fail. The titles claim that the howitzer leveled Bastogne's defenses in 48 hours is, as noted, a misstatement. The weapon defended Bastogne. It did not attack it. But the underlying question, why did German troops fear the 105mm howitzer, has a clear answer. They feared it because it worked, because it was always there, always firing, always ready to turn an assembly area into a killing zone or an attack route into a corridor of death. They feared it because no tactical skill could overcome it. A well-trained German infantry company executing perfect small unit tactics could still be annihilated by artillery fire, called in by a single American observer. A Panther tank, nearly invulnerable to American tank guns in frontal engagement, could be disabled by a howitzer shell striking its engine deck. Artillery negated training, negated equipment advantages, negated courage and determination. It was impersonal, mechanical, and unstoppable, and they feared it because it represented something larger than the weapon itself. The 105mm howitzer was a product of American industrial capacity, of a nation that could produce millions of shells, hundreds of thousands of guns, and deliver them to battlefields thousands of kilometers from home. It represented a military system that valued effectiveness over tradition, that adapted doctrine based on combat results rather than theoretical purity, that gave junior officers authority to call in devastating firepower without waiting for higher approval. The howitzer was not the largest gun in the American arsenal. The 155mm gun had longer range. The 8-inch howitzer fired a heavier shell. The 240mm howitzer was more destructive. But the 105mm was the workhorse, the weapon that every division possessed in quantity, the gun that could be counted on to deliver fires when and where needed. At Bastogne, That reliability and availability made it the decisive weapon. General Patton, whose Third Army relieved Bastogne, understood the importance of artillery, perhaps better than any other American commander. He demanded aggressive artillery support for every attack, personally reviewed fire plans, and insisted that his artillery commanders push their batteries forward to provide close support. After Bastogne, he wrote in a letter to a friend, "The artillery won that fight. The infantry held the line. The armor broke through, but the artillery killed Germans by the thousands and made it possible for everyone else to do their jobs." Patton was not given to excessive praise of support arms. He believed in aggressive armored warfare, in movement and maneuver, but even he recognized that maneuver without firepower was suicide, that tanks without artillery support were vulnerable, that infantry without indirect fire was doomed. Bastogne proved the point. The garrison had limited armor, no air support for the first several days, and inferior numbers, but it had artillery in quantity and used it with skill. And that made all the difference. The final tally of artillery fired at Bastogne varies depending on the source, but the most reliable estimates suggest approximately 48,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition, 15,000 rounds of 155mm, 8,000 rounds of 4.2-inch mortar, and smaller quantities of other calibers. Total artillery ammunition expended over 75,000 rounds in 7 days. The logistics of delivering that much ammunition to a besieged garrison by airdrop under fire stands as one of the remarkable achievements of the campaign. The air transport crews who flew those resupply missions faced German anti-aircraft fire, flew in marginal weather conditions, navigated to a small drop zone with limited navigational aids, and delivered their loads with acceptable accuracy. Without them, the artillery would have fallen silent by December 23rd, and Bastogne would likely have fallen shortly thereafter. The howitzers were crucial, but they were part of a larger system that included transport aircraft, supply depots, ammunition factories, and the entire logistical infrastructure of the Allied war effort. This systemic approach to warfare was perhaps America's greatest advantage in World War II. The United States did not produce the best individual weapons in every category. German tanks were often superior. German machine guns were feared. German artillery was technically excellent. But American weapons were good enough, and they were produced in quantities that made quality differences irrelevant. More importantly, American weapons were employed within a system that maximized their effectiveness, that provided the training, logistics, doctrine, and support necessary to use them to full advantage. The M2A1 105mm howitzer exemplified this approach. Not the most advanced artillery piece ever designed, but reliable, effective, producible in quantity, and employable within a fire direction system that turned individual guns into a coordinated weapon of devastating power. At Bastogne, that system faced its most severe test and passed convincingly. When the siege ended and Bastogne was fully relieved, the howitzer crews did not celebrate. They cleaned their weapons, performed maintenance, replenished ammunition stocks, and prepared for the next mission. The war continued. Germany still fought. There would be more battles, more fire missions, more days of serving the guns under difficult conditions. Bastogne was over, but the work continued. The howitzers rolled forward with the advancing armies, crossed the Rhine, supported the final offensives into Germany, and fired their last combat rounds in May 1945, when Germany surrendered. Then they fell silent. Missions complete, barrels worn, mechanisms tired. Some were brought back to the United States for display or storage. Many were scrapped. A few survive in museums, monuments to an era when artillery was king of the battlefield. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.